Hi Planet Earth, hope you're doing well. This lecture video is meant to provide you a review of the mass extinctions unit, namely the specific content that you'll need to know for the test. So definitely watch this, make sure to take detailed notes. You should have learned by now that there are categorically 5 mass extinctions that are called mass extinctions. These are known as the Big 5 mass extinctions. The most recent one is the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction, which took place about 65 million years ago. Prior to that was the Triassic-Jurassic mass extinction, which took place around 200 million years ago. Prior to that, the End-Permian mass extinction, that was the largest mass extinction in the history of life on the planet, took place around 250 million years ago. Prior to that, the Late Devonian mass extinction, which took place around 360 million years ago. And prior to that was the End-Ordovician mass extinction, which took place around 445 million years ago. And this is a good summary table illustrating all of those mass extinctions. Here it might be relevant for you to get out your geologic timescale handout to reference it as we go forth, because it definitely depicts a lot of these mass extinctions in more detail. The End-Cretaceous mass extinction is symbolized right here with the associated changes in the biosphere. The Triassic-Jurassic mass extinction right here. The End-Permian mass extinction right here. The Late Devonian mass extinction right here. And the End-Ordovician mass extinction right here. At the outset here, before we get into more details about each one of these mass extinctions, I'd like to review how geologic time is established in the first place, at least how the ages of these mass extinctions were defined based on the rock record. And that's through using a process that will pull into play some of the stuff you've learned in chemistry, and the process is called radiometric dating. So in chemistry class, you've probably learned about radioactivity in the nuclear chemistry unit. And so when you think of different elements on the periodic table, each one of those elements has different isotopes. And what an isotope of an element has the same number of protons but a different mass number. So it has the same atomic number but a different mass number. And so, for instance, carbon has many different isotopes. The most prominent isotope on Earth is carbon-12. And because carbon has 6 protons, that means carbon-12 would have 6 protons and 6 neutrons. But there's also carbon-13, for example, that has 6 protons and 7 neutrons. Certain elements exist in isotopic forms that are unstable. They don't have a stable balance of protons, neutrons, electrons. And so what happens is what's called radioactive decay, and that's where you have an unstable isotope, an unstable atomic nucleus, and it's losing energy by radiation. And in chemistry class, you have learned or will learn about the common forms of radioactive decay: alpha decay, beta decay, gamma decay. And those specific mechanisms I'm not going to review right now, because that you're going to go over that in chemistry, and they're not going to be tested in this class. But it's important to know what radioactive decay is in order to understand radiometric dating. So let's focus in on radiometric dating. When a rock is formed, and you can think about, let's say, an igneous rock forms, 1 billion years ago, or a sedimentary rock is deposited under the Central Texas Cretaceous Sea 100 million years ago. What happens is that that rock type consists of probably a wide variety of different elements. Depending on what's incorporated at formation, there will always be some of those elements that are existing in radioactive or unstable isotopic form. And usually this is just a trace amount, but that's all that's needed. So what you need to know is that rocks, when they form, they incorporate trace amounts of radioactive isotopic forms of elements. And for these different radioactive atoms, scientists have been able to establish the rate of decay. So, how long it takes for the unstable parent atom to radioactively to decay into a stable daughter atom. So, to radiometrically date a rock, all you need to do is you take a sample of that rock and you analyze it, and you determine how much radioactive isotope is still present as compared to the abundance of those stable daughter or decay product isotopes. And that allows scientists to determine how long that particular rock has been around. And it's almost a process that we take for granted. It's very cool. You can take a sample of rock and do mass spectrometry on it to figure out the abundance ratios of the isotopes in that rock and determine how old that rock is. This chart shows you some of the major isotopes that are used as what are called radioactive clocks, which basically means these are the radioactive isotopes that scientists would be looking for in rock samples. So over here you have what the radioactive isotope is. You can see carbon, I was talking about carbon-13 before. Well, carbon has a radioactive isotope, it's carbon-14, and it takes 5,730 years for half of a sample of carbon-14 to decay to the stable daughter nitrogen-14. And that's what's called half-life. So carbon-14 has a comparatively pretty short half-life. So probably not the most useful isotope to date rocks because you would really not be able to date rocks that old. When we look at dating rocks that are much, much older, you want to be looking at some of these isotopes, which these parent isotopes have much longer half-lives. It takes a lot longer for half of those samples to decay into stable daughter, and so you can date rocks that are a lot older using those. So this again is possibly stuff that you already know, but it's important to recognize when we start talking about, oh, this particular rock was formed X number of years ago, that you actually have an idea of how scientists are figuring that out. So here are the categorical Big Five mass extinctions labeled on the geologic timescale. And it's important to know that life goes through ebbs and flows in terms of biospheric diversity. So these aren't the only times in which life has died in the history of life on Earth, but they're categorized as mass extinctions because one or more events have caused a significant percentage of the biosphere to die off at that particular time. So we're going to go through these in sequence, and the sequence is going to be from the most recent to the most distant. And I'm going to talk about some of the statistics regarding the mass extinctions and then some of their theorized causes. So the most recent mass extinction is the Cretaceous-Tertiary mass extinction, and we've talked about this date quite a bit in Planet Earth class. 65 million years ago is around abouts when this happened. And it had a pretty significant extent. 40% of the genuses in the biosphere at that particular point went extinct, and 76% of all the species on the Earth went extinct. And we know the most famous organisms that went extinct were the dinosaurs, although that's debatable in terms of a technicality because birds exist now, and we know birds evolved from the dinosaurs. So obviously some types of dinosaurs got through that mass extinction. But yes, most of the dinosaurs went extinct. And also a ton of other organisms. I have here ammonites on this slide as a very popular, very abundant category of marine-dwelling organisms that went extinct during the Cretaceous-Tertiary mass extinction. In terms of causes, you should know by this point that the main theorized cause for the Cretaceous-Tertiary mass extinction was an asteroid impact. However, there are also causes that other scientists have theorized as having happened in concert with the asteroid impact and possibly might have even been more effective in causing mass extinction. And those two are flood basalt eruptions, large-scale magmatic eruptions, And rapidly falling sea levels, some studies have also shown to have played a part in the Cretaceous-Tertiary mass extinction. So regarding the impact theory for the KT mass extinction, again, this is a review at this point, but the location of the impact has been determined, and it's on the Yucatan Peninsula, on the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula in an area called Chicxulub, Mexico. Here's a diagram showing the location of this crater, and the story of how they discovered this crater is pretty interesting, and it's summarized in that video that we watched. But it's important to know that this is a very well-supported theory, one that scientists treat as fact, that a large asteroid hit the Earth at this particular location around 65 million years ago. The theory that this asteroid resulted in the mass extinction and was the sole cause of the mass extinction is definitely more of a theory. The mechanism would be that the asteroid would hit the Earth, the resulting ejecta from the asteroid impact and the aerosolized asteroid would become atmospheric, which would basically coat the globe and block out sunlight, which would result in global cooling. Contaminants in the atmosphere would also result in acid rain. That would eventually evolve into a global hothouse style of effect, and all of this was diagrammed in the mass extinctions video that you watched. Basically, what we're talking about here is a super sudden, especially when you take into account geology, a super sudden atmospheric climatic change, one that the biosphere had no way of evolutionarily preparing for, and that results in mass extinction. Just as important as noting the location of the asteroid impact is noting the abundance of evidence around the world that this occurred. These pieces of evidence are found in what's called the KT or KPG boundary. And this is a layer of rock that really falls right in between Cretaceous-aged rock and Tertiary-aged rock. And there are a lot of different outcrops, sites around the globe where you can see the interface between the Cretaceous and the Tertiary, or more recently named the Cretaceous and the PG Paleogene. And those specific lines of evidence are itemized here: iridium, shocked quartz, tektites, and tsunami deposits. This is review at this point, but iridium is an element that's not too present on Earth, yet they found an abnormally high abundance of iridium at the KT boundary layer. And the thought as to why that is extraterrestrial objects, specifically asteroids, have a very high iridium concentration. So if an asteroid hit the Earth, was fragmented, and all of the fragments in particulates and aerosols of that asteroid were deposited in a layer, then that layer would have a very high, an abnormally high iridium concentration. Second piece of evidence in the KT boundary is quartz that has shock lamellae on it. So a normal quartz grain under polarized light looks like this over here on the left. It doesn't have any type of striations. In areas that have been associated with very high energetic events like nuclear blasts and other types of things, what happens to the quartz grains and the rocks in those areas is they get shocked. They develop these sort of shock metamorphosed looking things, and you can see that right there, all those little lines. It takes a lot of energy to shock a quartz grain like this. And so the finding of shocked quartz grains in the KT or KPG boundary layer is evidence of a high energy event, and the thought is that an asteroid would have been that specific high energy event. Third type of evidence in the KT or KPG boundary is the presence of tektites or spherules. You can imagine when you drop this is a weird analogy, but if you drop a rock into a glass of milk, what happens is all of the milk sort of spews out from the impact of the rock in little droplets. And so what's happening when a large object hits the Earth is it's basically liquefying the solid material of the Earth. And as that sort of liquefied solid material sprays out into the atmosphere, it resolidifies. And it resolidifies very quickly, such that it doesn't have time to form an organized crystalline arrangement. So it recrystallizes quickly into a sort of a glass-like substance, and that's what these tektites or spherules are. And you can see some that are associated with the Chicxulub impact. So they're finding these types of little circular beads or droplets in the KT boundary with increased prevalence near the Chicxulub impact site. And this is indicating that a high energy event served to liquefy the Earth, forming these sort of liquid glass beads. And a last piece of evidence, not the last piece of evidence, but the last piece of major evidence in the KT-KPG boundary is the presence of tsunami deposits. So in the video, Alan Hildebrand is reviewing a tsunami deposit in the Brazos River site in Texas, and he explains the evidence for why that's a tsunami deposit. Lots of jumbled up rock all together of a variety of different sizes. And there have been a ton of different tsunami deposits that have been associated directly with KT boundary sites, indicating that this rock, this asteroid that hit the Earth, must have hit some water of some kind, which set off tsunami waves into the surrounding areas. In your independent research for the Extinctions project, you most likely encountered geological research that contained this sort of thing here. So what we're looking at here, and honestly, most of the papers that I've looked at that have anything to do with the geology of mass extinctions and the evidence for mass extinctions have diagrams that look kind of like this. And what it's showing you is a diagram of a cross-section of the Earth. So just like we were constructing for Shoal Creek and for McKinney Falls, and sometimes like we can look at when a creek has cut down into the rock, or a cut has been made by humans to establish a road in an area, you can see a pie slice of the Earth. And these particular pie slices are visible and are what are called outcrops, and they're visible around the globe. And in different outcrops, you can see different ages of rock, etc. And you might recall that in the Shoal Creek outcrop that we visited, and in the outcrop at McKinney Falls State Park, the KT boundary was not visible. The most recent bedrock that we saw in those two locations was of Cretaceous age. But in some areas, the KT boundary is visible. Now, let's say you can't actually see it in an outcrop. Well, you can actually drill a core. And so some of these types of things might be not specifically from outcrops, but might be from cores of the Earth. And you'll see up here in this map, a lot of these things are rock from the middle of the ocean, and that's not an outcrop, obviously. That's going to be a core of the Earth that they extract and then analyze the rock layers in that core. So in terms of elaborating on evidence for the asteroid impact theory of the cause of the KT mass extinction, this is a graphic that you might have seen in your research that is, I think, really useful. And what it consists of is up here at the top you can see a global distribution of sites that they've analyzed cross sections of rock for. And these sites they've categorized down here by color. In yellow, these sites are the furthest away from the Chicxulub impact site. In orange, these are sort of an intermediate location away from the Chicxulub impact site. Red means close to Chicxulub impact site, and purple means very close or right on top of the Chicxulub impact site. And down here at the bottom you can see a variety of different types of evidence. I want to draw your attention specifically to presence of iridium, the sort of green line, shocked minerals, which are those blue dots, and what are called ejectospherules, which are basically, we can call those tektites. And so let's examine those pieces of evidence a little bit more carefully. You can see that in all locations, distal, intermediate, proximal, and very proximal, a radical spike in iridium is present right at the KT boundary, and so that would be supporting evidence. What you can also see, and I think this is really neat, you can see that the other type of evidence, ejectospherules and shocked minerals, increase the closer you get to Chicxulub. So you can see the depth here of ejecta and shocked minerals is pretty shallow, way over in Spain. When we get to the western interior, a little bit closer, like North America and the Caribbean, you can see that the depth of the ejectospherules and shocked minerals is a little deeper. Much closer in Mexico, well, now it's a lot of high energy and tsunami deposits are a lot closer. And then right on top of Chicxulub, the depth of that is really great. So this is showing you that, yes, the impact site is Chicxulub, and the evidence for the asteroid impact is present around the globe, indicating that the output of this asteroid was a global event, an event of global significance with tie-ins to mass extinction. You can also look at the association between the KT boundary layer and the mass extinction itself. So this is another cross-sectional diagram from the western North Atlantic. And in this cross-section, they've looked at foraminifera, which are sort of planktonic microfossils, and the video elaborated on what those specifically are. But they're really good biomarkers. Looking at these tiny plankton fossils and what happened to them through the KT boundary. So the KT boundary, you can see here, is signified by a nice spherical bed, which is iridium rich. And going across the KT boundary, these are Cretaceous forams. They categorized all the forams present in the Cretaceous rock and then analyzed what happened to them going up in the rock record. And you can see there's a precipitous drop in the presence of those Cretaceous foraminifera fossils. And so that would be indicating, supporting evidence for a mass extinction. And you can see there's like a nice turnover here where your Cretaceous fossils die off, whereas your surviving fossils extrapolate into that ecological vacancy. So further evidence for an asteroid impact as the cause of the KT mass extinction. One thing to elaborate on here, which comes up quite a bit in KT mass extinction research, is fern spikes. Fern spikes are critical markers of mass extinctions for three major reasons that are listed here. One, fern spores are really easily distributed. They're much more easily distributed than seeds, and they can survive in a wide variety of conditions. So when you see a mass die-off of flora and fauna, one of the first categories of organisms to repopulate after that extinction are ferns. So as an extinction marker, you can look for spikes in the fossil record of the existence of ferns as support that a mass extinction actually happened. This is data from a cross-section in New Zealand. You can see the rocks are symbolized and listed in that cross-section over here, and the KT boundary is indicated here by this iridium spike. And look what happens with ferns. So here we're looking at ground ferns and tree ferns as compared to other types of plants. You have other gymnosperms here and angiosperms. And so this would be the line indicating the KT boundary in the rock record. And what you see is immediately after that line, and even sometimes during that line, ferns are rapidly repopulating in the biosphere, whereas other types of plants take much longer. So you can see that there. And then angiosperms, I'm not even seeing recovery at all, even on this diagram. So you can see the coincidence between the iridium spike and the KT boundary and the fern spike as an extinction marker, which is also supporting evidence for the asteroid impact hypothesis. As you most certainly know at this point, the asteroid impact hypothesis is not the only theorized explanation for the Cretaceous mass extinction. There is also the supervolcanism explanation. There is evidence that a large supervolcano called the Deccan Traps was erupting in what is now India near the end of the Cretaceous period and through into the Tertiary period. So this diagram here on the left shows the location of the Deccan traps in present India. And over here, that's what India would have been looking like around 65 million years ago. It's tectonically slowly migrating away from the continent of Africa toward its present location. And if you remember our study of the history of plate tectonics, the migration of India is one of the most recent major movements in terms of plate tectonics. So over here on the right, you can see the three distinct large-scale phases of Deccan Trap volcanism. And when we're talking volcano here, we're not talking Mount St. Helens. We're talking like Yellowstone, like super volcanism, caldera-style eruption. So you can say phase 3, phase 2, and phase 1. And phase 2 is the largest phase of this volcanism, and this phase ends abruptly at the KT boundary. So that's associative evidence that this supervolcano could have played a role in the mass extinction. As far as how they know that this specific phase 2 was the largest scale eruption of the supervolcano, you can see over here on the y-axis that the y-axis is depicting the relative thickness of the deposition of the lava. And so the thickest section of that deposition is specifically this phase 2 deposition. So that's how they're inferring that. This is a cross-sectional diagram of end Cretaceous early tertiary rock from a researcher named Gerda Keller out of Princeton University that she published in 2011. You can see the KT boundary here is symbolized by that iridium spike. So there's the KT boundary, is this red line down here in the middle. And this is illustrating further that phase 2 of Deccan volcanism in the rock record ends right around, almost exactly on that KT boundary. And this paper illustrates that associated with phase 2 of Deccan volcanism, there's a faunal turnover in plankton foraminifera. So remember, planktic foraminifera are those tiny sort of microfossils that are serving as marker species. And you can see that a lot of them go extinct. A lot of these Cretaceous forams go extinct right after phase 2 of Deccan volcanism. And also we see the emergence of a lot of new tertiary forams right after Deccan volcanism, and some more later here. So this is further evidence that Deccan volcanism played a role in the end Cretaceous mass extinction. The mechanism there is similar to the mechanism for the asteroid impact hypothesis. The mechanism of extinction, just a lot of material getting thrown up into the atmosphere and resulting in pervasive global cooling, acid rain, subsequent global hothouse, etc., etc. One thing that I haven't yet discussed that comes up in almost all mass extinction research is what's called delta C13, or a negative carbon-13 excursion. You probably read this type of language in research papers before. Gerda Keller symbolizes the association over here on the left, and you can also use this, just like we're using this iridium anomaly here as a marker of mass extinction, a marker of where the KT boundary is. As a marker of mass extinction, you can also use delta C13, and I want to explain what that is and how it's an extinction marker. So what delta C13 is specifically a measure of the ratio of two isotopes of carbon, carbon-13 and carbon-12. It's a measure of the ratio of those isotopes present in marine fossils like foraminifera. So what you would do is you would take a marine fossil, you would basically grind it up and analyze it using mass spectrometry to detect the amount of carbon-13 versus the amount of carbon-12. And once you have that ratio, you can actually figure out some pretty interesting things. So when they photosynthesize, plants preferentially take up the lighter isotope of carbon, which is conveniently also the more naturally abundant isotope of carbon, carbon-12. they take that up during photosynthesis, the lighter isotope. And what that leaves behind as a result is a higher ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 in any given water column, let's say the ocean. Remember that carbon-13 is a significantly less abundant isotope of carbon. If you look on the periodic table, the weighted average atomic mass for carbon globally is 12.011, which means that most of the carbon isotopes on the planet are carbon-12. So a very small portion are carbon-13. So because of this, it's important to note that the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 in any given marine fossil is always going to be less than 1 because there's always less carbon-13 than there is carbon-12. Nevertheless, because plants preferentially take up lighter carbon-12, if there are more plants around, that leaves less carbon-12 in the water column. Remember that marine organisms in that water column use the carbon in the water column to build their hard parts. So if you see in a particular marine organism a really high carbon-13 to carbon-12 ratio, a really high delta C13, or a relatively high delta C13, that must mean that a lot of plants were around at that particular time that organism was forming its hard parts. A lot of plants were around yanking carbon-12 out of the water column. However, if you see a relatively low delta C13, a relatively low ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 in a particular planktonic microfossil, for instance, that means that there weren't many plants around yanking carbon-12 out of that water column. So what scientists will do is they'll look at the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12, the delta C13, in a given marine fossil from a given time period to make an inference about how many plants were around at that particular time period. High delta C13 indicates more plants were around. Low delta C13 indicates fewer. So how this plays out in terms of mass extinctions is you can use delta C13 levels as a marker of mass extinctions. If you see relatively stable delta C13 and suddenly it drops precipitously, that must mean that during a geological instant, all of the plants in that given area died off, because you're seeing what the literature calls a negative delta C13 excursion, which is a really long way of saying a sudden drop in the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 present in marine fossils in that cross-section. And that indicates a precipitous drop in plant life. So for all intents and purposes, you just need to know that delta C13, specifically a negative delta C13 excursion, or a huge drop in delta C13, is how scientists mark mass extinctions. It's how they determine when mass extinctions took place. So back to Gerda Keller's research in this cross-section, you can see that a negative delta C13 excursion is present here, a very quick drop in the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 in the microfossils in that cross-section, which indicates that plants died off rather immediately at that particular location at that time. And that time is coincident with the end, basically, of phase 2 of Deccan volcanism and that iridium spike. So what it's kind of looking like here is that the end of the Cretaceous was really a sort of a no good, very bad day for everything. We had this huge supervolcano happening, and we also had a large asteroid hit the Earth. And so it's very difficult to differentiate between these two things as mass extinction causes. So you can kind of just say both were involved, even though scientists argue about it incessantly for long periods of time. So let's move on and talk about other mass extinctions besides the in-Cretaceous mass extinction. Going further back in time from the in-Cretaceous, which again happened around 65 million years ago, we get to a mass extinction that occurred around 200 million years ago. And dinosaurs were around at this point, not some stereotypical dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus rex and the large sort of apex predators that evolved during the Cretaceous period, the middle of the Cretaceous period. We definitely have dinosaurs, and a lot of them went extinct at at the end of the Triassic period. This was around 200 million years ago. 47% of the genuses of life went extinct, 80% of the species around the globe went extinct. As far as likely contributors, we once again have our two major players, flood basalt eruptions or supervolcanism and asteroid impact, and let's review those. Any paper that deals with supervolcanism as a cause of the Triassic-Jurassic mass extinction most certainly addresses CAMP, or the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. And here there was, at the end of the Triassic, the way the tectonic layout looked is there was this large continent called Gondwana. Might not be something you're familiar with, but you can see that given the terrestrial landscape of the world, this was an enormous supervolcanic system. It extends through what, to me, based on this map, is looking pretty much like, a good fifth of the entire globe, at least in terms of where land is. So a very large supervolcanic system. So this is a very complicated research graphic, but because we've discussed some of the commonalities we see in mass extinction research graphics, it should be a little bit easier to piece together. So again, what we're looking at here is a stratigraphic cross-section. So these are just pie sections, pie slices of the Earth's surface in different locations. So this one over here is in Austria, this one's from the United Kingdom, this one's from Germany, this one's from Morocco. So around the globe, and you can see that we're going down in the pie slice over here in terms of the stratigraphy. So this location here represents the end of the Triassic and the beginning of the Jurassic period. And that's associated with, as we talked about, that extinction marker, a negative delta C13 excursion. So this stands for initial negative CIE, carbon isotope excursion. And you can see these drops here are serving as extinction markers. So we know that there was a mass extinction at basically the end of the Triassic into the Jurassic, symbolized by those negative excursions, which meant precipitous drop in plant life. And this is associative evidence, but what they're looking at is the relationship between the timing of the mass extinction and the onset of the main phases of Central Atlantic Magmatic Province supervolcanism. And it's pretty coincident. You can see here that this block represents the beginning of the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province volcanism, camp volcanism. And it looks like that volcano starts going off right around when this mass extinction occurs. So that's associative evidence there. The evidence for extraterrestrial impact is a little bit more sporadic, and some of you might have encountered some of this in your research. It's a little bit harder to find, but there is evidence supporting extraterrestrial impact at the end of the Triassic period, and a prime example comes from some cross-sections from the United Kingdom and involves two things, seismite and tsunamite. These are just complicated words for different types of geology that provide evidence for either seismic activity or tsunamis. What seismite is I've defined it here as a very deformed rock, usually a very deformed sedimentary rock, that is resulting from something that was a very high energy event. Tsunamite would be wave-rippled rock, similar to, you can think of it being a very, very intense, exaggerated version of the ripple marks in the limestone that we saw at McKinney Falls, indicating a very violent wave-style event. So that's what seismite and tsunamite are. Evidence of large-scale, high-energy events. And volcanism can't really create seismite and tsunamite. What they're seeing at different cross-sections in the UK, this one over here is from Ireland, this is from South Wales, and this is from southwest England. Here would be the boundary between the Triassic and Jurassic period. And what they're seeing preceding or right before this boundary in the rock record is the presence of both of these sort of high-energy event deformed styles of rock. So that means that some high-energy event happened in the terminal Triassic that resulted in rock looking like this. It couldn't have been supervolcanism that would create rock of this nature. So the thought there is that it was an extraterrestrial impact. So for the Triassic-Jurassic mass extinction, we have two potential culprits that come up quite a bit in the literature, supervolcanism and impact. Whereas for the end Cretaceous mass extinction, the impact theory is the prominent one. For the Triassic-Jurassic mass extinction, the input I'm getting from the research is that supervolcanism is kind of the primary contending theory, whereas extraterrestrial impact is also there, and there's evidence for it, but it's less distinctly supported in the literature. Okay, folks, get ready. If you're still awake, it's time for the Permian mass extinction, which is the big whopper, the cat's meow, the bee's knees of all mass extinctions. 248 million years ago, look at this. 56% of the genuses around the globe went extinct. 96, holy cow, 96% of all species globally went extinct. Think about how much of an evolutionary reboot that is. Only 4% of the species on the planet remained after this mass extinction. To fill the space on this slide, I've put a couple of the more popular organism types that went extinct in the end Permian mass extinction. And let's look at likely contributors. We have our two common players, flood basalt eruptions and asteroid impacts. But there's also papers that deal with things like large amounts of methane being released and drops in global oxygen levels. So there are a lot of other potential culprits for the end Permian mass extinction besides just flood basalt, supervolcanism, and asteroid impact. But those are the two that we're going to be focusing on because of the project that we do. So if you're researching volcanism as far as the Permian mass extinction goes, you most surely encountered the Siberian traps. This drawing illustrates the look of the planet in the end Permian. There was the Pangaea supercontinent, and you can see the Siberian traps up in what is now Russia. Then it was a landmass up here, and there they are. So a little bit smaller comparatively than what the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province looked like during the end of the Triassic period. Nevertheless, this has shown, evidence has shown this to be the primary cause, at least scientists think the primary cause of the Permian mass extinction, and I'll show you some of that evidence. So in the mass extinctions video, they illustrated that the Permian mass extinction, the main cause of that was these Siberian trap eruptions. But they also were talking specifically about a line of evidence that comes from zircon crystals, tiny crystals that are in rock samples, specifically basaltic rock samples that form from these volcanoes. And radiometrically dating those zircon crystals gives a ton of information about the specific dating of when these volcanoes were going off as related to the end of the Permian. And the specific type of radiometric dating they're using to date these zircon crystals from the end Permian is uranium-lead dating. So if you remember that diagram at the beginning of this presentation on different types of radiometric dating, well, they're using these two isotopes, parent and daughter, presence in these zircon crystals to infer the age of the surrounding rock. And this is what their analysis has illustrated. So what you can see over here on the left side, what these are giving are age ranges for the dates of zircon crystals associated with basaltic melt rock that results from these Siberian traps. So they have kind of three phases here of this eruption sequence of the supervolcano, the Siberian traps. Here's stage 1, here's stage 2, here's stage 3. And to date these eruptions, what they're using are these zircons, and you can see the age range of some zircons here illustrating stage 1. These are the age ranges of zircon crystals they've used to date stage 2, and then these are the age ranges used to date stage 3. So they've come up with a fairly precise history of the eruption record of the Siberian traps using radiometric dating of zircon crystals present in those rocks. And you can see the relationship between, critically, the stage 2 eruptions and the mass extinction. So this is in the rock record right here where the end of the Permian is. And again, this is just sort of, you're looking kind of like down at a pie slice of the Earth. Over here you can see the negative delta C13 excursion. So this would mean that's the point where plants are dying off in a precipitous fashion. And the cool thing about this is you can see that the delta C13 excursion here and the onset of stage 2, the most massive stage of the Siberian traps, are very coincident. And it's that type of association that scientists are looking for when they're looking for causation. And it's important to note that correlation doesn't imply causation, but that's the evidence that they have. You can also see up here that there's another smaller negative delta C13 excursion, another smaller mass extinction that can be associated with stage 3 of the Siberian trap eruptions. So primary evidence here that the Siberian traps were involved in the Permian mass extinction. As far as evidence for extraterrestrial impact as causing the end Permian mass extinction, a cool line of research comes from fullerenes. And what fullerenes are, if you've learned about this in chemistry class, carbon has different allotropes. So, for instance, graphite is an allotrope of carbon, a form of carbon. So graphite is strictly carbon, solely carbon, but it's formed in a crystalline fashion in a certain way. Diamond is another allotrope of carbon. Diamond is just carbon, but it's carbon crystallized in a certain way. A recently discovered allotrope of carbon is called a Buckminster fullerene, and it is carbon 60, C60, and they're little molecules that can consist of 60 carbons arranged in a kind of globe-shaped structure, and they're called Buckminster fullerenes. They're named after the architect Buckminster Fuller, who made architectural domes that looked kind of like this. You might have also heard of buckyballs. That's the same thing. Buckminster fullerenes, buckyballs, all the same, carbon 60 arranged in this fashion. And how this relates to mass extinction research is that buckyballs, Buckminster fullerenes, have been shown to trap noble gases. And so what scientists can do is they can look at rock from the end Permian and look at the noble gases that are trapped inside buckyballs from that time period, that formed during that time period, to get an idea of atmospheric composition during that time period. So what this is illustrating, this diagram over here on the right, this graphic, is showing a helium atom that has been trapped inside this buckyball cage. So pretty cool. How this relates to extraterrestrial impact is what they're finding from buckyballs that are present in Permian Triassic boundary sediments. So this is, remember, the KT boundary is that boundary layer defining the interface between the Cretaceous and the Tertiary. Well, the PTB, or Permian Triassic boundary, is the boundary layer that defines the interface between the Permian and the Triassic. And they're looking at this rock, and they're looking at fullerenes, and what they find in those fullerenes are noble gases that don't have a very Earth-like isotope ratio. And not only is the isotope ratio they're finding not Earth-like, it very closely resembles the isotope ratios for noble gases found specifically in meteorites, which is directly connecting meteorites with the Permian-Triassic boundary. So let's look at some of this data. This is the most famous one of these studies from 2001, and it's specifically from a cross-section in Japan, and it concerns the noble gas helium. So remember that the number on the periodic table you're seeing for helium is 2, which means that pretty much all helium on Earth is helium-2. So what they looked at in Japan in a specific cross-section, and this is showing you the rock layers in that cross-section over here, they looked at the isotopes of noble gases present in fullerenes, because remember, these fullerenes are trapping gas. That's how you can get gas out of rock. Pretty cool. And what you can see is over here they're looking at the levels not of helium-2 but the levels of helium-3, which is not an Earth isotope of helium. And to give you this data, they've zoomed in on a particular part of this cross-section right around the Permian-Triassic boundary, right here. So they've kind of zoomed in. You can see that this whole thing here is illustrating just that portion of this cross-section. And approaching the boundary, you can see that amount of helium-3 trapped in fullerenes remains about 0. And then right as you get up to the Permian-Triassic boundary, strangely, there's this weird spike in the amount of helium-3. And as I mentioned, helium-3 is very present in meteorites. So this is associative evidence that they're using to suggest that there was an extraterrestrial impact that hit the Earth around this time period. It's pretty amazing to me that they can get information about the gases present in Earth's atmosphere from rock. And it's these buckyballs that are trapping those gases. Pretty cool. So to summarize the end-Permian mass extinction, the majority of evidence in the scientific community suggests that supervolcanism, specifically the Siberian traps, played the most major role in the Permian mass extinction. But there is also evidence for a variety of other things, and I've given you some of the lines of evidence for extraterrestrial impact as being an associated cause. On to the late Devonian mass extinction. So this is called the late Devonian mass extinction because it took place kind of in two distinct pulses that were near the end of the Devonian period. So it's not called the end Devonian mass extinction, but the late Devonian mass extinction. It took place around 359 million years ago. Again, there's a range of time there. And its extent, a mass extinction, pretty massive, not as massive as the end Permian by any means. 35% of the genuses of the world went extinct, 75% of the species. Here's a couple examples of species that went extinct on the right. In terms of likely contributors that information I've obtained from research, we have our two common players, asteroid impact and flood basalt eruptions. And another thing that comes up pretty frequently in the research is the evolution of plants as drastically changing atmospheric conditions and leading to a mass extinction for other organisms on the planet. We're going to review these two as our major ones, specifically because of the project comparing the two. One of the primary lines of evidence for impact theory as causing the late Devonian mass extinction is the Siljan impact event. They found a crater in Sweden with rock that dates to around this time period. And so this is a situation, and it's rare that scientists actually find craters. I think Chicxulub and this Siljan crater represent kind of outliers in impact theory research. But this crater has been discovered, and it dates to around that time period, and so a lot of scientists are arguing that this is the major player in the late Devonian mass extinction. They've actually also found another impact crater. This one is in what is now present-day Nevada, called the Alamo impact crater. And they're using the same types of evidence as they did for Chicxulub to define these impact events, right? Shocked quartz grains, things like that. They're finding concentrations of shocked quartz grains in this area associated with a potential impact site, which they're putting a question mark around because they're not exactly sure where specifically the crater is. They're just using all of the associated evidence. Over here, it kind of shows you what this area would have looked like on the left. This would have been the terrestrial marine margin and what they're calling the Proto-Pacific Ocean. So it looked a lot different than what present-day Nevada looks like. But this is another associated impact crater. The rocks from this crater, the ejecta from this crater date to the late Devonian period. So it's thought, and scientists have argued, that it is associated with that extinction event. But just like we've seen with more recent mass extinctions, volcanism also comes up as a competing theory here. So if you did volcanism research for the late Devonian, you most certainly encountered the Volui traps, which are a supervolcanic system that there's evidence for in what is now Siberia. This is, down here is the look of the Earth in the late Devonian period, and you can see that the large landmass is called Gondwana. And the Volui traps would have been up here on a very, very, very ancient version of Siberia. So it's interesting to analyze, just like they did for the Siberian traps. Scientists have looked at the eruption record of the Volui traps and how it coincides with the late Devonian mass extinction pulses. As I mentioned, the reason why they call this the late Devonian extinction is that it occurred in two pulses in the late Devonian period. I've listed what the names of these two pulses are called. One is called Kellwasser, and one is called Hangenberg. I'm probably mispronouncing those. The Kellwasser event was the first pulse, and it occurs near the boundary between two sort of sub-periods in the late Devonian, the Frasnian and the Flaminian. Weird names that you do not need to know. That's what FF boundary stands for. And the Hangenberg event was the second pulse, which occurs near the Devonian Carboniferous boundary. So this is at the actual end of the Devonian period. So this is why it's called the late Devonian mass extinction, because these two pulses occurred at separate times. But a cool thing to notice, especially if you're a scientist that supports the supervolcanism theory of this mass extinction, is that the major pulses of the Volui traps are consistent with these two events. Here's cross-sectional evidence supporting that. So basically what they're looking at are, they're using zircons from the deposits of the Volui traps to date the two distinct phases of this supervolcanism, and they're labeling phase 1 there in the rock record and phase 2. And this is just a big pie slice of the Earth here. And you can see phase 1 coincides very nicely with that Kellwasser event near the FF boundary. Phase 2 coincides, it kind of ends right near the DC boundary in the Hangenberg event. So scientists supporting this will say, look, the phases of the Volui trap volcanism coincide with the two major extinction pulses in the late Devonian. So here I'm kind of torn between these two examples. There's clear evidence of impact craters. There's also clear evidence of supervolcanism, and scientists are debating the causes of the late Devonian mass extinction all the time still. Moving on to the earliest categorical mass extinction, we have the Ordovician-Silurian mass extinction. This is the earliest of the big five. It dates to 443 million years ago. And 57% of the genuses in the globe went extinct, 86% of the species around the globe went extinct. And as you can see, when we've been going back and back and back in time, getting to older and older and older events, the life looks simpler and simpler and simpler and simpler. And we'll see that kind of as a theme as we continue on in the course. And those of you who researched this mass extinction probably encountered that this kind of represents an exception to our norm, because there's really no evidence of an extraterrestrial impact having caused this mass extinction. That doesn't mean that one did not. The further you get back in the rock record, the harder it is to find evidence of that type of thing. But the two major players here are flood basalts that we've seen before, but an even bigger player for this specific mass extinction is glaciation. And so people that were researching the role of extraterrestrial impact for this mass extinction probably quickly figured out, not going to be great, there's not much research out there for that, so they probably went into trying to illustrate why glaciation, not flood basalt eruptions, was the major cause of this mass extinction. So let's talk about glaciation first. This is a very interesting drawing, and it illustrates the extent of the glaciation in the late Ordovician period. You can see that most of the land in the late Ordovician period is this supercontinent Gondwana, and I'll try to kind of outline the boundary of what I'm seeing is this big supercontinent here. And look at this. Most of that entire landmass is covered in ice. So here's the boundary of the ice. Pretty amazing. And that's the minimum extent of the ice sheet. It got even bigger than that. So this was a huge glaciation. And the thought here is that this huge glaciation led to this mass extinction. And you might not immediately see why a glaciation can cause a mass extinction of this nature, but the two sort of major pathways are there's a rapidly cooling global climate, and that's going to be a problem because at this particular time, all of the biosphere was adapted to a very, very hot planet. And this represented a very quick global cooling. Again, geologically sudden. Organisms hadn't evolved to adapt for it. The second player here is when you start forming a glacier of this magnitude, your sea level drops because a lot of the water that was in the sea gets retained on land as ice. And that changed a lot of the seaways around the planet, and a lot of these organisms at this particular point in time lived in the sea. Especially in sea environments that are near coastlines because the water's shallower there and a lot more nutrient rich and warmer. And so you can see these networks here. And these are the types of networks that would have been starting to rapidly change if sea level fell. Ocean life, which was very complex at this point, the most complex life at this point was marine, would have definitely been affected by this. Terrestrial life, well, because there's large sheets of ice covering the terrestrial landscape, would have also been affected. So, showing support for this glaciation as a cause of extinction, this is a great summary graphic illustrating a lot of trends. So you can see up here on the left side, this is the Ordovician-Silurian boundary. So that's showing you where the end of the Ordovician period is. And these scientists did a lot of study on the decline of different types of organisms during that period. So you can see that these drops are indicating extinction pulses in the late Ordovician. You can also see that that's coincident with a delta C13 negative excursion. So this would be lots of plant life here and a rapid drop of plant life right there, that negative delta C13 excursion. What they're using to signify the formation of a glacier, a large glacier, is another isotopic signature, which is called delta O18. Now, you're probably getting sick of these isotopic signatures at this point, and I promise this is the last one, but it's really cool to see how scientists can use isotopic signatures to infer the presence of a glacier in the geologic past, and in this case, we're talking about over 400 million years ago. So I want to elaborate a little bit here about what delta O18 is to give you information about how it connects with glaciation. So just like delta C13 is a measure of the ratio of carbon 13 to carbon 12 present in marine fossils, delta O18 is a measure of an isotopic ratio, specifically the ratio of oxygen 18 isotope to oxygen 16 isotope present in marine fossils. So to explain how this data is utilized, I want you to think about an ocean and seawater evaporating from that ocean. The oxygen content in that water vapor is preferentially oxygen 16. Oxygen 16 is the lighter of the oxygen isotopes. There are two pathways for this oxygen-16 rich water vapor. And the pathway that is chosen depends on the climate. If it's warm enough, that water vapor ends up precipitating back down to the earth and eventually returning to the ocean. However, if it's cold, specifically cold enough such that ice forms on continents, that oxygen-16 rich water vapor, yes, precipitates down, but it gets retained on the land as glacial ice. If this oxygen-16 rich water vapor gets retained on land as glacial ice, it never returns to the ocean, and accordingly the remaining ocean on Earth is preferentially enriched in oxygen-18. Remember that marine fossils are using the oxygen in the ocean to manufacture their hard parts. So, if you have a glaciation occurring and oxygen-16 rich water vapor is getting trapped on land as glacial ice, the ocean being O18 enriched, accordingly, marine fossils are going to be using a higher ratio of oxygen-18 to manufacture their hard parts. So in those marine fossils, you see a correspondingly higher oxygen-18 to oxygen-16 ratio. Here's a graphic that I think will really help you understand this. So starting up here at the top during a non-glacial period, you have an ocean that contains water that has some water molecules have oxygen-16, some water molecules have oxygen-18. During evaporation, it's preferentially water that contains oxygen-16 that leaves. And so clouds would be formed from water vapor that's enriched in oxygen-16. During a non-glacial period, it's warm enough that any oxygen-16 enriched water vapor that gets precipitated down on land ends up returning to the sea as runoff. Let's look down here at this glacial period, however, if it's really, really cold. If it's cold, then oxygen-16 enriched water that evaporates, it gets precipitated back down, but it gets trapped on land as glacial ice and does not return to the ocean. So this means that this ocean water becomes enriched in what the diagram is calling isotopically heavy water, which just means enriched in water containing oxygen-18. And remember that it's oxygen in seawater that marine organisms are using to craft their hard parts, and it's those hard parts that get fossilized. So if you see in the fossil record a dramatic uptick in the ratio of oxygen-18 to oxygen-16 present in marine fossils, that is evidence that there was a glaciation during that time period. Okay, so this is going back to that graphic I was showing you that's sort of a comprehensive evaluation of evidence at the end of the Ordovician. So again, here's the end of the Ordovician period. And remember the biomarkers that are showing that mass extinction. And remember delta C13, drop in delta C13 is indicating precipitous drop in plant life. As we just talked about, though, a rapid increase in delta O18, like that, is indicating the onset of a major glaciation. So the correlation here is onset of major glaciation resulting in precipitous drop in plant life. At least that's the thought. That's what this graphic is intending to illustrate. And both of these are just from cross-sectional data, and so it's very clear here that glaciation is a major player in the end Ordovician mass extinction. The evidence I've found in the literature for supervolcanism as a potential compounding contributor to the end Ordovician mass extinction comes from what are called mercury anomalies, and I'll elaborate on what those are. Volcanoes, especially supervolcanoes, these flood basalts, spit out a ton of elemental mercury. So if you see in the rock record a dramatic uptick in the amount of deposited elemental mercury present in the rocks, that's indicating a large-scale volcanic event having taken place. So what they're finding, this is one research paper, for example. What they're finding, this research paper looks at two cross-sections, one from South China and one from Laurentia. And this left-hand panel, so far left is showing you just cross-section of the Earth in two different locations. These left-hand panels here, though, are showing delta C13, and you can see that this is the end-Ordovician mass extinction here, a dramatic drop in delta C13. Up here you can see, well, there it is. And what they're finding in these cross-sections is immediately preceding this negative delta C13 excursion is a dramatic uptick in the amount of mercury in those rocks. So this supports the idea that there was supervolcanism, large flood basalt style volcanism, during the end Ordovician that could have potentially, in combination with the glaciation, led to mass extinction. So to kind of summarize this end Ordovician mass extinction, looking at the research, the major line of evidence for mass extinction suggests that glaciation is the primary cause. But there's some research that also supports supervolcanism, flood basalt level volcanism, as a sort of correlative contributor. But that leads to a great question. How in the world can something like volcanism contribute to glaciation? If these two things are working together, they seem to be almost opposite. How does volcanism lead to glaciation? So your initial inclinations about volcanism are really correct. When supervolcanoes, these large-scale igneous provinces, erupt, they dump a bunch of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which leads to a runaway greenhouse effect and definitely warms the planet. But what happens afterwards is a little bit more subtle, but also worth analyzing. Remember that volcanoes, while they definitely dump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, they also dump a ton of igneous rock onto the surface of the planet. Think about a supervolcano, like the Deccan Traps that were contributing to the end Cretaceous mass extinction. You can see at map level the basalt deposits of the Deccan Traps on a map of India. So it's a ton of rock. So when you get a lot more rock, in this case it would be rock of volcanic origin, so igneous rock, deposited on the surface of the planet, you're exposing a lot more rock to weathering. And chemical weathering serves to yank carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So the thought here is, this is kind of the connection between volcanism and glaciation, is that yes, in the short term, volcanism would lead to a warming of the planet. But in the long term, the fact that volcanoes are serving to deposit so much basalt on the surface of the planet, which is then exposed to chemical weathering, that results in a dramatic drop in the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which leads to a runaway cooling and accordingly a glaciation. And I know this is really complicated, and remember that the connections between these two things are very theoretical, especially when they're occurring over 400 million years ago. But it was a good question that was asked a couple years ago in my classroom, specifically, well, you're talking about the connection between volcanism and glaciation. How exactly does that work? And so this is the theory, at least. So let's look at kind of a summary of these big five mass extinctions in terms of common contributors. Our big two players, we've seen flood basalt eruptions involved in potentially 5 out of 5 of the mass extinctions, and in some of those the involvement is more definite than others. We've seen asteroid impacts involved in potentially 4 out of the 5 mass extinctions, the most famous of those being the end Cretaceous mass extinction, the Chicxulub asteroid. So let's connect this with our course goals. Remember, in planet Earth, we're looking at ways by which changes in the physical planet result in changes in the biosphere. and we've just evaluated a ton of different ways by which physical changes have resulted in mass extinctions. Asteroid impacts and flood basalt eruptions are definitely physical things. But we can draw an even more interesting sort of commonality between these things. Think of what's common between asteroid impacts and supervolcanism. What do both of those things have in common? The commonality here is rapid, large-scale climate change. Flood basalt eruptions yield that, asteroid impacts yield that. And we're talking here about climate changes that happen so quickly, almost instantaneously on a geologic timescale, such that the biosphere has no way to respond, and the result is mass extinction. And it's particularly disheartening when you think about what's going on today with anthropogenic climate change and how we're seeing, and we've talked about this before, what scientists suggest is a sixth mass extinction because humans have created climate change of this magnitude. And so that's almost looking at this the other way around, where a biological organism is creating a change that is very physical. So interesting connections to make. So going back to the geologic timescale, looking at these big five mass extinctions, hopefully this video provided you a good review of their causes and their effects. Where we're going after this unit is over is we're traveling further back in time, and we're going to be stopping at this particular juncture here. Remember that this timescale really goes back much further to around 4.5 billion years ago. So this is really a zoomed in on the more recent portion of geologic time. And so life, as we mentioned at the beginning of the course, life evolves, scientists think, around 3.8 billion years ago. And for billions of years after that, it's not really doing much. And what you can see here is starting around 550 million years ago, there was a rapid diversification of life that took place over a very, very short amount of time. And it's an event called the Cambrian explosion. So we're going to talk about that in the next unit of this course.